So, welcome at Utrecht Blockchain Nights, the online edition. We are Lisk Center Utrecht. Normally we host physical meetups, but since Corona, we are also doing online meetups. And every month we talk about blockchain use cases with experts from the field. Every month we take a specific theme. This month it's healthcare. And we let some experts from the Netherlands or abroad talk about their projects and introduce themselves. So today we have three speakers, Joost, Mark, and Abe. Joost and Mark are co-founders of Triall.io. Triall creates blockchain solutions for healthcare, for clinical trials, and they will tell you more about those clinical trials and also COVID. Afterwards, Abe will tell you about tokenomics and token ecosystems and how that relates to each other. So we have room for one question after one talk. So we have three talks, one question, and afterwards, if there's time enough, we have a short Q&A. Drop your questions in the YouTube chat channel or in our Discord. I'm looking forward to Joost, this first speaker.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I hope you can all hear me all right. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening. My name is Joost Vlag. I'm one of the co-founders of Triall. As Jurgen mentioned, we build blockchain applications for clinical research professionals, for clinical trials. And I want to talk today briefly about what clinical trials are, what it generally takes to bring a new medicinal product to the market, and of course, how blockchain technology can play an important role throughout that process. I'll start with a brief introduction of myself. As I mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Triall and also the head of clinical affairs, meaning that I specifically look at how our applications meet the needs and demands of clinical research professionals. I've worked as a clinical research scientist for the past 5 years. I'm also a project manager and medical writer within clinical trials. I have a background in neuropharmacology and business management and a PhD on microbiota research, again, within clinical trials. Now, to start my presentation, I first want to have a brief look at what it takes to bring a new medical solution to the market. To illustrate that, I have an image here that provides a high-level overview of what's generally involved in bringing a product to the market. You start in your preclinical development phase in the laboratory using animal models to test whether there are certain compounds that have potential to become a medicine for human intervention. And within that phase, you file for a patent so that you can later on sell it with exclusive rights on the market. But before you can bring it to market, you test that compound, that target compound, into so-called clinical trials to determine whether the product is safe and whether it's effective to treat a specific indication. And after the clinical development phase, indicated in orange below here, you get market authorization and you can sell your product on the market. Now, it's important to note that there's really a small chance of one of these target compounds to eventually be sold on the market as a new medicine. Only 1 out of every 10,000 compounds is eventually sold as a drug. And there's also huge investments involved. Generally, developing one new drug costs about $2.5 billion American dollars. And that's for the compounds that make it to the market. And of course, a lot of them fail as well. Now, to protect pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies from these large investments up front, you can file for a patent so that you can later on sell it exclusively on the market to get a return on investment. But this 20-year patent protection, of those years, you generally spend around 10 to 12 years testing your product in clinical trials. So you can imagine that if you have a delay somewhere in your clinical development process, that delay could cost millions or billions of dollars eventually as you shorten your exclusive rights to sell it on the market. And that ultimately increases the price of the drug for patients in need. So that's why it's so important to have fast and efficient clinical trials. Here's a brief overview of what clinical trials look like. So I mentioned you start preclinical in the laboratory, and then you move on to phase 1 clinical trials, where you test your drug in small doses in healthy volunteers to determine whether it's safe for human consumption. Then you move on to your phase 2 clinical trial, generally 50 to a couple of hundred patients, to determine whether your product is effective to treat a certain indication. And then you move on to the most important development phase, the phase 3 clinical trials, where you test your product in around 5,000 patients globally, multiple countries, multiple research sites. And on average, a typical phase 3 clinical trial collects over 1 million data points and costs around $20 million. Now, there are several trends that we see within clinical research. Over the years, there's an increasing number of stakeholders involved in the clinical development process. Think of pharmaceutical companies, contract research organizations, research sites with their investigators, pharmacists, biostatisticians, or other specialized vendors. They all need to collaborate and have their own standard operating procedures, their own IT infrastructure. So collaboration on a global scale with these stakeholders can be a challenge. Our industry is also highly regulated by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in the US, or the European Medical Association in Europe. Everything that happens in your clinical trial, every data point, every safety event needs to be meticulously documented. It needs to be audit trailed. You need to be able to tell in 20 years what exactly has happened throughout that 12-year development process. And we also see that clinical trials are becoming increasingly digitalized. For my personal taste, not as much as I would like to see, but there's definitely a trend towards digitalization. We use smartphones, smartwatches to capture research data, but we also use specialized e-clinical software applications that are designed to make clinical trials more efficient. And that e-clinical software market is growing quite substantially. You can see that towards 2025, we expect to see a 14% growth rate, growing towards 12 billion globally. Now, this is primarily the case in North America and Europe, but we see a trend towards globalization of clinical trials. Specifically, Africa is one of the major growing regions. But despite these so-called e-clinical software applications designed to increase efficiency of clinical trials, there are still many persistent challenges that we see in the day-to-day conduct of our clinical studies. First and foremost, there's a clear lack of oversight when we conduct clinical trials. As I mentioned, we work with so many different specialized stakeholders who have their own IT infrastructure, their own legislative region, and standard operating procedures. That's difficult to share data in real time across these institutional boundaries. So generally, you see that data is scattered across different systems and across different organizations, thereby reducing the oversight that a pharmaceutical company or contract research organization has on their clinical trial. And that in turn leads to a delay in record keeping, which increases the timelines of clinical trials, which increases their costs, drives up the cost of the eventual product when it's sold on the market, and introduces certain safety risks for the participants involved. Moreover, we see it time and time again that certain clinical trials have to be reiterated or re-performed. For instance, when a large pharmaceutical company purchases a smaller biotech company, which is generally the case, often you see that their phase 2 clinical trials have to be re-performed because the data has not been deemed reliable, the audit trail was not sufficiently documented, and the delays in record keeping ultimately lead to the fact that these trials have to be re-performed, which is a huge waste of money and time, of course. Now, we believe that blockchain technology can play an important role in the future of clinical trials to support their efficiency and trustworthiness. For instance, we can use blockchain technology to generate verifiable proof of the existence and integrity of certain data objects or documents. So you can imagine that there is a researcher in Africa, for instance, who has a patient visit, gathers the patient data in a site visit and stores it in the database. As soon as that database is complete, you need to lock it before you do your statistical analysis to provide a layer of trust that the data has not been altered. Now, by registering that database or each specific document before that on the blockchain through a hashing process, you can always prove that that document was present at a certain point in time and that it has not been altered since. And that, of course, reduces the possibility to conduct fraud and misconduct in clinical trials, where there are substantial examples that we have seen in the past, and increases the trustworthiness and reliability of your clinical trial study dossier. We can also use blockchain technology as a means to improve safe and compliant transfer of medical data between the different stakeholders involved in clinical research. For instance, by using the blockchain as a decentralized identity and access management systems, by applying a decentralized identifier to a person and to an object, you can set out the rules and determine which person has access to a certain data object in a manner that's exclusive to that person and not to others. We can also use smart contracts to automate certain workflows and rules within a clinical trial. Now, we have to realize that clinical trials are highly structured and need to be performed in a certain sequence of events. You need to gain regulatory approval, you need to sign a research protocol, patient participating in a clinical trial need to sign their informed consent forms before you can conduct any kind of study activity. And by setting out the sequence of events in a smart contract and logging every event that has taken place, again, in an immutable audit trail on the blockchain, ultimately provides substantial proof that you have conducted your clinical trial in accordance with the guidelines and regulations as stipulated by the FDA and EMA. And that's the reason why we founded Triall, because we believe that blockchain technology will play a crucial role in the future of clinical trials. So we collaborate with a series of partners and stakeholders so that together we can build these e-clinical software applications for clinical research professionals, relying heavily on the strengths of blockchain technology as well as artificial intelligence. Now, here's a brief overview of our current partner network. I won't go into much detail, but I just want to highlight two of our partners. We closely work together with CR2O, which is a Dutch contract research organization for clinical trials, where most of our clinical trial expertise comes from. And of course, we work together with Sphereon, who will speak with you today later, who have a tremendous background in blockchain and document management development. And together, we're building towards a multi-sided platform of modular but integrated e-clinical solutions. Here's an overview of some of the applications that we are working on. Currently, we have developed the Triall electronic trial master file. This trial master file is an application that is used in basically all clinical trials. All your essential study documents are stored in the trial master file. And as we have connected the trial master file with a blockchain architecture, any user who uploads the documents into the TMF can click on the right mouse button, register it on the blockchain, and at that point in time can prove that their document was present and that it has not been altered since, even over the course of 12 years throughout your entire clinical development timeline. And we have used the TMF in the first real-world clinical trial that uses blockchain technology. So I'm quite proud of that, because I'm sure that this will happen more and more in the future. We're also looking to build an integrated dashboard of all these isolated e-clinical solutions called the clinical trial, the CTMS, the trial clinical trial management system, or an integrated dashboard of applications. We're looking to build a partnering platform for the different vendors involved in clinical trials. And most importantly, we're building open source APIs that allow other third-party e-clinical software providers to connect with our infrastructure, with a blockchain architecture, and with each other, so that together we can truly build towards a digital ecosystem for clinical trials, and thereby turning potential competitors into collaborators, and improve the way we conduct clinical trials to make them smarter, safer, and more efficient, as you can see in our roadmap here. Now, I also wanted to briefly highlight some of the advisors that we work with, but given the time, I will just skip this slide and leave some room for a question before I give the word to Mark van der Waal. if someone could tell me if a question is written within the chat, because I currently cannot see it.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the talk, Joost. Really, really insightful. And one question from me before I get any questions sent in. With whom are you building the platform? Is it only Triall that builds the platform, or are all the stakeholders part of the platform?
That's an excellent question, thanks. So specifically for the Triall master file, we are working together with Sphereon, our main technology partner. And we are really quite happy with the collaboration that we have. But for other projects that are on the roadmap, I haven't detailed them all. We also work together with different partners. Think, for instance, of a patient recruitment and retention application or a treatment adherence application that we are developing. We work together with the LUMC and the National eHealth Living Lab, for instance.
Thanks.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and I didn't see any other questions. Then I'll just ask another one myself, and then we'll move on to Mark.
I've got one, Jure.
Oh, yes. Then I give the word to you.
Hello, my name is Albert. I used to work in healthcare and also did something with blockchain. And I was wondering, how is the uptake for this solution with the pharmacy companies?
That's a great question. So to answer your question, our solutions are not really intended for big pharmaceutical companies. We tend to look at the research industry, which have a suboptimal infrastructure of e-clinical solutions. And that is around 70% of the entire market. And what you see is that there generally is huge interest in blockchain technology, but there's still some misconceptions that you see. For instance, I spoke at the Clinical Operations Day last year, and there's misconceptions on blockchain that it would be a huge waste of energy, it's not green, or it's used for illicit projects. So that are some of the misconceptions that still live and that we need to educate on. But other than that, we have been using our eTMF application with this blockchain architecture in real-world clinical trials and several consortia projects, and more are to come. I think it's important to mention that we make sure that the end user doesn't really notice that a blockchain is involved. We just mention to them, these are the advantages that you have by performing these procedures, rather than explaining what blockchain is, or making that a very visible component of the trial master.
Okay, just a small follow-on one.
Yep.
Please don't limit yourself to the small companies, because I once visited Boehringer Ingelheim in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
I did a small trial on using blockchain for informed consent, and their whole management team didn't want to use it. They still want to use their current software system with silos, etc. So there are also chances in big pharmaceutical companies.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I've actually spoken with Boehringer Ingelheim in Amsterdam as well regarding the informed consent blockchain application that they have. Personally, I feel there are some limitations, as it's not a decentralized public blockchain, but rather a private chain. But regardless, I love seeing that innovation and take up, and I hope we see it more in the future as well. But thank you for that insight.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answers.
Then I will give the word to my colleague Mark, who is sitting next to me, and I will move 1.5 meters away.
Thanks, Joost, for having me. And I think I can just continue, right, Jure?
Yes, you can.
All right, let me just quickly fix my things. All right. Yeah, so thanks, Joost, and thank you all for having me on this very warm summer evening. Let's see. My name is Mark van der Waal. I'm a co-founder and head of product design for Triall. But tonight I will discuss a use case for blockchain that I have been investigating as part of my PhD research at the Athena Institute of Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And first of all, it's important, I think, to emphasize that the following use case is not being pursued by Triall. It really has been an academic endeavor aimed at exploring the impact potential of several emerging concepts and standards in blockchain and related technologies. When applied to a very specific use case, that is the field of international research and cooperation during outbreaks of infectious diseases. Now, we have been studying this context for quite a while, for several years now, and the insights that I will share are many contributors. So I'd like to acknowledge them right from the start. Most importantly, these are my co-authors. So, for instance, Carolina Ribeiro and George Haringhuizen at the RIVM, Center of Infectious Disease Control, Linde van der Burgwal and Erik Klaassen at the Athena Institute, and Moses Ma at Future Lab in the US. So I think it's also important to emphasize that it's not realistic to think that the mechanisms that I will discuss during this presentation could have changed anything to the course of the current COVID-19 pandemic. As we explain in our paper on the topic, and it's also referenced in the slide, the key enabling technologies have only appeared very recently, and development and standardization is still underway. But more importantly, maybe, successful implementation really requires the involvement of many stakeholders in a very complex and very political field. So this is not something that is easily achieved. But we discussed this at length. Our aim really today and has been to put a dot on the horizon and to show, to explore how these mechanisms may be used to prepare for future outbreaks of infectious diseases and inspire system reform. So I think that the past months have proved everybody in a quite radical way that infectious disease outbreaks pose a real threat to society. And we should realize that in an increasingly mobile and interconnected world, we have to prepare the necessary structures and systems before the onset of new pandemics. So as we say, in peacetime, so that we are able to effectively respond to future emerging or re-emerging infectious diseases. Now, effective response, of course, depends on authorities taking appropriate public health measures, so social distancing, hygiene instructions, source and contact tracing, but it also significantly depends on the rapid development and widespread deployment of what we call disease-specific medical countermeasures, such as vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And in any case, we need, of course, sound scientific evidence to inform effective outbreak response activities. And this requires that data and information are shared among many different types of researchers around the world and under tremendous time pressure, because really a matter of days can prove significant in terms of containment of an infectious disease outbreak. So there are persistent barriers to this process that you see on this slide right now that obstruct the sharing and cooperation in the context of epidemic emergency. And I'll give you an example for each of these, but first it's relevant to quickly walk you through the typical stages of this process. So let's go to the first one. First of all, of course, the process is initiated by recognizing an outbreak through syndromic surveillance. So, for instance, when health centers report unusual rates of certain disease symptoms. And such an outbreak represents an unmet medical need that demands an immediate response by infectious disease researchers. To do so, researchers need to be able to access the material samples of the pathogen, which can be taken from infected individuals and then should be shipped to labs with the proper biosafety levels and the proper research capacities. And these samples, in turn, enable researchers to isolate the pathogen and to sequence its genetic code, and in this way to discover and characterize the causative agent of this infectious disease. So this genetic sequence data then is used, well, it's a major input for targeted R&D on the medical countermeasures. So, candidate vaccines and for candidate diagnostics. And patents are usually claimed once research has demonstrated proof of principle. So when it's clear what the vaccine candidate will look like, or the diagnostic technology, or the antiviral, well, the process then moves to the preclinical and clinical research phases, and this is discussed by Joost, of course. So this is the testing, the evaluation of these candidate vaccines, for instance, first in animal models and then in human subjects. And to complete this innovation cycle, as we call it, of course, you have a lengthy process of full development, manufacturing, market authorization, and finally, you're on the market with a novel vaccine that can be used to prevent spread, to prevent infection. So this value chain, and this is important, depends on sharing among a very complex ecosystem of stakeholders. So these include, for instance, public health authorities like the WHO, who are really supranational organizations. But also you have, of course, national governments that are at play, that need to be in the loop. You have academic researchers, and you have industry partners. And these really are all are necessary to constitute an effective R&D response. And without an efficient flow of key outbreak-related resources, so the samples, for instance, the material samples, but also the genetic sequences and results of early preclinical R&D, without the sharing of these resources, this chain is really frustrated, and this also frustrates the development of medical countermeasures. So we have been identifying and studying prominent outbreaks over the past 2 decades, and we have identified several barriers to the sharing of these resources, and therefore to the development of countermeasures. And these are rooted in a lack of trust among these stakeholders, complex regulations that are generally put in place to restore trust, but are really bureaucratic hurdles to sharing. Conflicting incentives between, for instance, public actors, public health actors, and industry stakeholders or academic stakeholders. And finally, uncertain ownership rights over candidate vaccines or any other resulting technologies. So the lack of trust. First of all, this can be traced back to the sensitivity of the data and the potential value of the resource involved. So, for instance, governments have been seen to deny foreign access to samples, not trusting other countries to make resulting vaccines available at affordable prices. And a very prominent example of such distrust was presented in 2007 during an outbreak of H5N1 influenza in Indonesia. And the same goes for data resources. So even in the presence of secure data portals, governed, for instance, by the WHO, you see that researchers may not share their data because they do not trust the database security or the confidentiality of the users of those data hubs. So in terms of the regulatory frameworks, these are generally put in place, as I said, to restore trust and to protect stakeholder rights. A prominent example is the Nagoya Protocol, and this stipulates that access to any genetic research sources must be preceded by consent from providing countries and bilateral agreements between resource users and resource providers on the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of those resources. Now, this is, in principle, this is good stuff. It's good that these regulations are in place, of course, but they also represent a huge bureaucratic burden for researchers, even for those who want to act ethically and really want to act sound in this whole process. So users are responsible for tracing rights holders to negotiate and obtain the certificates and permits for any sample that they want to use. And this due diligence process is very time consuming. So during the Zika epidemic in Latin America, these procedures, for instance, obstructed the validation of diagnostic technologies, which directly translated into difficulties in medical decision-making for pregnant women who could not really decide whether it was safe to continue their pregnancy, whether their babies will be born with malfunctions. Then, as a third major barrier, we have conflicting incentives. So when materials or data resources are shared, you want as many competent researchers to be able to use it in their research, of course, because it offers more allies and more opportunities to develop proper countermeasures. Yet there are many individual incentives that conflict with the common goal of responding as quickly and as widespread as possible. For instance, researchers have an incentive to publish papers, peer-reviewed papers, and to demonstrate that they are the first to discover something, what we call scientific priority. Or, of course, they have an incentive to find out whether they are able to claim for patent rights, for intellectual property rights. And this competition translates into fragmentation of research efforts. And we see, for instance, also during the current COVID crisis, many data silos for genetic sequences. So the same goes for the current SARS coronavirus strain. In turn, as a final major barrier, well, this fragmented R&D, of course, also translates into fragmented intellectual property rights landscapes. So having multiple labs perform the same R&D may result in conflicts over who holds the legitimate claim to patent rights for a certain candidate vaccine. And as discussed for SARS in 2002, this can lead to conflicts over who holds the claim, and this really delays the process of investments in the lengthy process of clinical trials, because industry stakeholders do not want to infringe on any intellectual property rights, and they're unclear about who holds these intellectual property rights. So, to move to blockchain, I will leave the context a bit and move to the solution part. So, what we did, we asked ourselves the question: what conditions should be present in this R&D ecosystem to really overcome these barriers? First of all, we need time-stamped, indisputable proofs of the existence, integrity, and the priority, so scientific priority, of R&D outputs, so that individual contributions to the generation of data or other outbreak relevant resources cannot be denied, and so that contributors can be fairly rewarded for their efforts. For instance, being named in resulting publications, being included in ownership rights, or other financial or non-financial returns to research efforts. We also need reliable mechanisms for identity and access management across the existing systems for storing and sharing resources. And we need to make sure that access can be regulated on the basis of explicit terms and conditions, so to assure that only permitted entities that have the right credentials can access the resource. We also need reliable mechanisms for mapping stakeholders and their agreements throughout this value chain that we just walked through. So who has contributed to what aspect of the R&D process? And this requires that we can reliably track access and use of these R&D outputs and are able to show how these outputs build upon each other. In this way, we can really consolidate rights holders to certain R&D outputs at the end of the process, and also consolidate stakeholders to the returns that may be generated from these outputs. Finally, we need to facilitate and ease compliance to the applicable regulations for sharing resources. Well, blockchain technology enables the mechanisms to satisfy these conditions. And we have conceptualized a possible blockchain-based system that combines several of these emerging concepts. In this way, blockchain can be applied to really underpin the outbreak R&D ecosystem as a common, inviolable, and verifiable layer of records for identities of network entities, such as resources, data objects, for instance, but also for individuals, organizations, for rules, such as terms and conditions for access and benefit sharing, and for events. So access events, transactions in the context of benefit sharing. So first of all, identities. In the system that we conceptualized, Decentralized identifiers, or DIDs, would be registered for all entities in the network. So DIDs are blockchain registered. They contain no personally identifiable information. They are globally unique, and they enable cryptographic authentication of identities and associated attributes, such as qualifications, permissions, or other verifiable credentials, without any central authority involvement. But DIDs are applicable beyond authenticating individuals. They can be registered for any type of entity, so also for devices, for databases, and they can refer to service endpoints outside of the system, such as services for data storage, for instance, or for discovering the current physical biobank location of a viral sample. So this really underpin the identity and access management system, but also offer some sort of decentralized directory of all relevant entities in the network. Regarding rules, smart contracts can be applied to handle permissioning of these identities, of these network entities. But it can deploy and enforce terms and conditions for access and benefit sharing. And in the system, we conceptualize that they will be offered through a certified template library. We explain in the paper that, for instance, the Global Health Security Agenda offers a very suitable multi-stakeholder platform to oversee the implementation of such a library and the curation of such a library. And this would, of course, be to ensure the security of these contracts. And second of all, to support harmonization and compliance to the relevant legal frameworks, such as the Nagoya Protocol. Finally, like Joost discussed, events. The blockchain can be applied to establish immutable audit trails. So the system could record who accessed which resource, when, and under which conditions. And such audit trails affirm rightful attributions between users and providers of resources. And they could also affirm that the right contributors to the R&D process are rewarded. Now, I don't think I have many minutes left, but I have put these concepts into a schematic. And please give me a sign if I should stop now, and then you can just read about this in the paper. But I'll just continue as long as you leave me. So I'll walk you through the process. It's a simple use case of sharing between a data user, a data provider and data user in the network. First, a data provider would register their DID in the blockchain, and second, they would store their data object in any existing storage service. So depending on the preferences of the provider, these may be open access repositories like the INSDC databases for genetic resources, genetic sequences, or these can be more restricted systems such as encrypted data vaults or semi-open platforms like GSAID. As shown in step 3, the system would enable actors to establish a record of their data object. So records themselves will be kept in an off-chain repository and only include indexing metadata. So fields that systematically describe the data object, the resource, such as, for instance, pathogenic properties or provenance or ownership. And this can enable querying and analysis by permitted entities that are allowed into this off-chain repository. Importantly, the system would hash these records and anchor them in the blockchain to establish timestamped proof of the existence and of the integrity and of the scientific priority of these R&D outputs. And as a final step, the data provider configures access terms and conditions through the contract templates, which, as discussed, are deployed through the smart contracts in the blockchain. So when we move to the user, the same goes for the registration process. So they would first register their identity and their attributes, then request access to discover records and the associated service endpoints in the off-chain repository. So an access interface would then communicate with the blockchain with the smart contract-based permissions and would verify the identity of the requester. The requester, the data users would then have to authenticate and authorize with the verifiable credentials. And if authorized, then the user can follow the service endpoint, and the user goes through the same authorization process at the data storage service. Now, of course, this requires proper access interface to these external storage services, And we discussed the feasibility of really developing these interfaces in the supplementary materials of the paper. I won't go in depth right now. This is the complete schematic. I realize that I've rushed through these concepts quite a bit, but I also want to leave some time for Abba. If you're interested, then I'm happy to share the paper and all the details and nuances with you. So thanks. I hope it was a bit clear, and I'm interested in your questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there questions? One question before Abba starts. And otherwise, I have one.
Sure.
So maybe let's just start with that one. So you are building a platform with a lot of players already, and in this case, this is a hypothetical case.
Yeah.
Do you think the current players will adopt these kind of platforms, or do you think, or would you say you would need a different mindset for it?
Yeah.
Which makes it more difficult?
It's a very fair question. We're proposing a technology-based solution, and the issues that we're trying to resolve are really non-technological. They are political, social, so we discuss in the paper as well that these will probably present the major barriers to implementation or development and implementation of such a system. But we also see, and this was quite cool to see, that those parties, those stakeholders that really at the supranational level are thinking about the system and how to organize it, really were interested in the paper and really are moving ahead right now, it looks like it, to explore these concepts. So I think I hope that we have put a dot on the horizon, really. And now this is not something that is realizable anytime soon. We realize that, but it is something that might be implementable over the course of several years. Now, of course, you need some time for people to get used to these concepts, and you need a multi-stakeholder platform to really follow all the necessary steps to involve everybody in design and development and in developing pilots. And we think that the Global Health Security Agenda offers a nice model for this, because they have some action packages also focused on technology solutions that could be applicable to piloting and to development. And we think that it's not all blue skies. It's not all just hypothetical. There are currently already just feasible solutions available that enable, for instance, the development of and implementation of several of the concepts that we discussed. So decentralized identifiers, verifiable credential solutions, but also contract templates that can be configured, for instance. So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yes, it does, and we of course need people like you to put these kind of concepts into perspective, to start thinking about it. Thank you for your talk, and let's go to Abba.
Thanks.
Yes, hello everyone. Let me share my screen. Does this work? Yeah, I think so. All right. Well, hello everyone. Good evening. My name is Abba Scholte. I'm a technical consultant at Sphereon. And at Sphereon, we mostly build and integrate blockchain infrastructure together with our partners. One of them is Triall, of course, which we're also very happy with. I think it's a very cool project, and it's an honor to be able to work on the technical side of it. I myself have a background at TU Delft and Gartner Consulting, where I did research on tokenized ecosystems a couple of years ago. I also worked at Odyssey, which is an ecosystem developer in the blockchain space. They organize all kinds of huge events like hackathons, and this year a not hackathon. We still have to wait what it's going to be. And over there, I was a tokenization lead, and I was developing novel ways to invest in protocols that are not owned by anyone. So for this talk, I'd like to start with a quote from Bill Gates, which goes, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10 years. Don't let yourself be lulled into inaction." And I think this especially holds true for blockchain and tokens. We've seen the most amazing pitches about how blockchain is going to change everything, and at the same time, we haven't seen much of that. But that doesn't mean it will happen in a way in a couple of years. Well, since this talk is mostly about tokenization, I will talk about the relevance of tokens within the blockchain world, give some definitions about tokens, because there's a whole array of types of tokens. And we'll talk about the perspective of the individual versus the collective, and how tokens can help with aligning their interests and incentives. And also how these are ideas are a bit, not new, but this tech allows them to really scale up and to be and to have things like privacy and stuff like that. And then I will give the link to healthcare as well. So for blockchain, there's of course different types of blockchain, and I like to really follow these 5 pillars of blockchain. And if you don't have some of these pillars or none of them, in my opinion, it's not really an open, permissionless blockchain. So blockchains need to be open, borderless, neutral, censorship resistant, and public. And if you have blockchains like these, they are built on a certain type of elements, real characteristics of blockchain. And not every blockchain has all of these characteristics, but let me go through them. So the first one is encryption, which we all know. So public-private key pairs, self-sovereign identity, uses a lot of encryption, for example. Immutability, so the storage on blockchain is append-only. Blockchains can use distribution, so there's multiple nodes running the same copies of a ledger, so there's no single point of failure. And also a lot of transparency, of course, because on every node you could see what is happening. Decentralization, which is really about that no single entity or a small controlling group is dictating the rules. So there's generally a consensus mechanism by everyone who is participating. And of course, tokenization, which is basically if you're transacting value through a blockchain, a token is the information bit that says what type of value is being transacted. And if you are looking at these 5 elements, you can see that over time, blockchain has been adding them over time. So first, there were just the enabling technologies of encryption and distribution. And the past decades, we really added immutability. And by the way, this is also research by Gartner, and they focus on projects that are actually adding value to businesses and people all around the world. So, for example, you can see here with the blockchain complete projects that they really need decentralization and tokenization, which is something of the coming decade. We've been trying this the last decade, but it's hard to see projects that are already being used at scale. So this is looking at projects that are already working at scale. And you can see that over time, blockchains get more and more complete, and even in after 2030, you can combine it with stuff like artificial intelligence to really enhance your blockchain solution. So if we're going to talk about tokens, it's good to have an idea what types of tokens there are. And all the way in the beginning, of course, there was only Bitcoin, and they named every other token an altcoin, which is not a very good taxonomy. So people try to delve deeper into token categories. So for example, there's cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, so stuff that you can buy with. A tokenized security is basically a digital representation of a physical asset or a financial tool. So it's basically a claim on a future cash flow. So I have this token, and if I cash it in later, I get money for it. This is all very global, of course. And then there is a utility token. Don't mind the text below, that's the wrong text. But utility tokens are, for example, a right that you can use a service in the future. Or if you have done some work for a protocol, you get some of these tokens in return, and you then can later sell them. So if you have provided some utility, you get some tokens for it, which you can use in another way. But it is unfortunately much more messy, since it can be viewed from multiple perspectives. And I've used the four main ones over here. So first of all, there is the technical perspective. So you can have protocol tokens, which are part of the incentive mechanism to make a decentralized protocol work. So basically the Bitcoin token or Ethereum, Ether. And then you have application tokens. So this is the layer on top of a blockchain, where an application is being run, and the tokens that are being run in that layer are called application tokens. Then there's a rights perspective. So if I hold a token, what rights do I have? Do I have a store of value? So this can be a security token or an asset-backed token or a currency as well. Or does it give me access to an activity? So, for example, does it give me rights to perform network services or to do something within any type of network? And there's the fungibility perspective. So some tokens are fungible. This means that if, for example, a euro is fungible, that if I give you a euro and you give me a euro in return, basically nothing happens. But non-fungible tokens, they are unique. So for example, a token can represent a piece of art, and another token can represent a piece of art, and they can be called the same token because they're based on the same application layer, but we cannot swap them for each other because they are inherently unique. So for example, such a token can also be a driver's license or a passport or an identity, stuff like that. And then there's the legal perspective, which I've already talked about on the previous slide. But this is basically if companies or organizations are going to use tokens in the future, what does it mean to hold a token on my balance sheet? How can companies or how can countries eventually tax me? Like what is the actual value of it? So the legal perspective is also still really hard. And then of course you can make it harder and harder. There is, for example, stable coins, coins which value are through an algorithm are kept really stable. So you always know that the value of it doesn't change that much. For example, like a Bitcoin can change a lot. And there's burn and mint tokens. So for example, if something happens, then my token is being burned. So it's being sent off to an address which is inaccessible by anyone. So you basically burn the thing. So this is also to keep, for example, the value in the whole system in check. But here's now some of my research that I did earlier, is that there's one unexplored business initiative that is called tokenized ecosystems. And that is really looking at what do tokens. So if you have an ecosystem or a network where people are contributing things, tokens actually keep track of who is contributing what, in what amount, and also if someone has a certain reputation in a network, should he be able to earn more or different types of tokens. So if you really think about a token, if you are holding a token, you earned the token somehow. So you bought it with money or with energy or with some work. And I now have that type of value, and now I have skin in the game, which means that I really want to that the protocol which the token is linked to, that's going well. Which means that if other people also are holding the token, that immediately our incentives are aligned, because we all want this protocol to do well, because then the value of our, what we bought or what we earned is going up. And now these tokens are basically also pieces of software. So they can be programmed, which means the way that people can earn these tokens, they can be programmed as well. So you can now program incentives. So you can get people to do stuff by rewarding them with tokens. And actually, Bitcoin is also using an incentive mechanism like this, because people can buy hardware and they can throw a whole lot of energy at it. And the Bitcoin network is using this for mining, it's called, but it's basically verifying and securing transactions. So there's a way where people can earn Bitcoins by securing the network. And we all probably know how much energy is being consumed. This is actually an old picture. So the whole Bitcoin network is producing or using more energy than the whole Czech Republic a couple of years ago. So this is how strong the incentive structure of such a network is. So tokenized ecosystems are a way to organize a business process in a more decentralized way. So not a company, but a community will create and sustain a business process, and its members are incentivized through token reward functions. So an example is Filecoin, where I can, with my own computer, I can provide storage to a network, much like Dropbox, but it's not a server, but people all around the world with their personal computers, and I can earn tokens for it. And with these tokens, I could sell them for money, or I can buy storage myself. And in this way, if the network is growing, normally the cost is still going up, albeit with smaller parts over time. But with this new way, if a network is growing, the cost of the infrastructure is actually going down, which is really interesting. So now I'm going to take a step towards citizen science, because it has something to do with tokens, because we're also aligning incentives over here. So with citizen science, individuals align themselves behind a single purpose, mostly science, for example. And what are their incentives? A good example is bird watchers. A lot of bird watchers count the birds and then send the data over to researchers so they can use the data for research. Another example is reCAPTCHA. We all know these when we want to try to enter a network. So we're actually incentivized to get through this reCAPTCHA to get on the website that we want to use. But actually, in the meantime, you are digitizing a scan of a book. So for example, here the word morning, you have to type morning, and the second word is the Czech word, which the system already knows. So here we are helping the algorithm to digitize books. They're not doing this anymore because all the books are almost all digitized. But for example, now on Street View, we're doing the number on houses or to see whether you can identify taxi drivers or traffic lights. And also, actually, the guy that invented reCAPTCHA sold the whole thing to Google, so that's why Google is using it now. And later on, he invented Duolingo, the translation app, which helps you to translate. But actually, in the meantime, you're helping to translate the Spanish Wikipedia, for example, because if you're getting an English sentence later on in the app when you're actually already pretty good, it automatically translates it to Spanish if your translation is the same as others who are translating it. This is actually a very old example. This is SETI at home, which is almost 20 years old. Millions of people have been using this, where they voluntarily giving up computer power to analyze radio frequencies from space to discover extraterrestrial intelligence. This is from the University of Berkeley. I'm speeding up a bit because of the time. This is another example in healthcare, actually. This is iWire from the MIT. This is actually a game, so people are incentivized through playing a game to map neurons in your brain, because there are so many different types of neurons. We don't even have it all mapped yet. And here we're helping the algorithm and the researchers with mapping them. There's about 500,000 gamers playing this every day, which is amazing. Now, tokenization in healthcare there's two very interesting projects that work with tokens in a way. Not only like, hey, a token can get you some money through an ICO, but also really looking at a multi-stakeholder system and trying to incentivize them to help you with your ecosystem. So both of them use ways to incentivize people to for ecosystem governance, for community engagement, for looking at data. So one thing that I would like you all to take away from this is, if you have an ecosystem with various stakeholders and you want them to align, so think about how tokens can help you, but first think about like the incentive structures, and then maybe think about the tokens, because tokens are still very difficult to figure out. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope there's still some time for a question. Yeah.
Yes, there is. Let's start with one or two questions. I got one question from Stefan Verhagen from YouTube. Very interesting, thanks. Can a utility token be created that has no value? And if not possible, of no value outside of the concerning blockchain?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This is actually a problem that a lot of ICOs were struggling with. So for example, if I have a network and I want people to do stuff on this network, and I want to reward them with a token, then if these tokens all have monetary value, a lot of them actually want to sell them on the market, and then the market adds a lot of velocity to the value of the token. So how can you know what the work that you're doing for a platform, what it's worth if the value is so volatile? So people are actually working on utility tokens that have no value at all, but for example, give some rights. So these can be voting rights, these can be rights to different parts of the platform. And they're also thinking about, well, maybe you cannot sell them directly to an external market, but they are thinking about like, how do you can still get some money for it, but not directly link it to the secondary market. So yes, it is possible.
Thank you. I do not see any other questions yet. Questions can also still be posted in the Discord channel always, and will be answered later. Let's just wrap it up, because it's we're a little bit out of time, but I think it was interesting enough to keep it going. And thank you very much, the three of you, for these really insightful talks. And I hope that we can see more of you in the future, of tokenized ecosystems and also of clinical trials. And I'm looking forward to use cases where people are using ecosystems as well as platforms, and let's see what works better for which use case. So thank you very much, and everybody is welcome to post the questions on Discord, and if you're not there, we'll send them through to you. Just Perfect. Make sure to link to Triall.io if you are interested in healthcare, and link to Sphereon also if you need blockchain solutions. So, any last words from your side?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us, and I would love to open up discussion. So please, people, send in some questions.
Same for us. Nice words. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, guys.
Bye all. Have a good evening.